There is a stretch of land on the border between Bolivia and Brazil, roughly 90 kilometers of territory, that sits in a kind of legal twilight that has no clean name in international law and no clean solution in international politics. It is not disputed in the way that most border disputes are disputed, with two countries both claiming the same ground and arguing over who it belongs to. It is something stranger than that, something rarer, something that, when you first hear about it, sounds like a mistake, like a clerical error that someone forgot to correct, a bureaucratic loose end left dangling for so long that it became a permanent feature of the landscape. Neither Bolivia nor Brazil officially claims sovereign jurisdiction over this zone, in the way that a government normally claims territory. The people who live inside it exist in a gap between two legal systems, two nations, two sets of rights and responsibilities, and the gap is not theoretical. It is 90 kilometers wide, and it has been there, in various forms, for over a century. And when you start pulling on the thread of why this exists, when you start tracing it back through the history of colonial cartography and post-independence treaty making and the specific geography of a part of South America that most maps reduce to a blank green expanse, you end up somewhere genuinely remarkable. You end up understanding something about how borders actually work and how they fail, and what the failure reveals about the assumptions we make when we draw lines on the earth and tell people those lines mean something. Subscribe right now if you want to see the world the way it actually is, not the version that fits on a news ticker, not the version that gets explained in 3 sentences and then forgotten, the real version, the version with history and geography and human consequence attached to it. Let's go. The place we are talking about sits in a region of South America that geography made complicated long before politics got involved. To understand the zone, you need to understand the landscape it sits inside, because the landscape is not incidental to the story. The landscape is the reason the story exists at all. The Bolivia-Brazil border in this region runs through some of the most physically challenging terrain in the Western Hemisphere. To the west, the Bolivian side, the land rises toward the Andean highlands, the Altiplano, and the mountain ranges that define the central spine of South America. To the east, the Brazilian side, the land descends toward the vast interior lowlands of the Amazon basin and the Cerrado, the enormous tropical savanna ecosystem that covers a significant portion of Brazil's interior. The border zone itself sits in a transitional landscape, not quite the high mountains and not quite the deep rainforest, but something between those two extreme environments, a region of rivers and marshes and scrubland and dense vegetation that the early colonial cartographers found extremely difficult to survey with any precision. This difficulty was not a minor inconvenience. It was fundamental. The entire system of borders in South America was inherited from a colonial land division framework that was itself built on the assumption that the territory could be measured, named, and assigned. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the newly contacted Americas between Spain and Portugal along a north-south line, was the original document in this story, and it was made by men sitting in Europe who had essentially no idea what the interior of South America looked like. They drew a line through territory they had never seen, across landscapes they could not have described, in a world where the tools for measuring longitude with any accuracy did not yet exist. The line was a political gesture, dressed up as a geographic fact, and the consequences of that original imprecision cascaded through 4 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history. When Brazil declared independence from Portugal in 1822, and when Bolivia emerged as an independent state in 1825, after the long and turbulent dissolution of Spanish colonial rule across South America, both new countries inherited the cartographic problems of their colonial predecessors. The borders they inherited were based on colonial administrative divisions that had been drawn, in many cases, through territory that colonial administrators had never physically visited, using survey methods of limited precision applied to maps of limited accuracy. In the flat coastal regions and in the high mountain ranges where natural features provided obvious reference points, the borders were reasonably manageable. In the interior, in the transitional zones and the river basins and the forests, they were often deeply ambiguous. The specific zone we are concerned with became the subject of formal diplomatic attention in the late 19th century, when both Bolivia and Brazil were attempting to establish clear and definitive borders between their territories as part of the broader project of building functional nation-states in South America. This was an era of significant border-making activity across the continent, driven partly by the desire for legal clarity and partly by the discovery that certain border zones contained resources, rubber in the Amazon basin, minerals in various highland regions, agricultural land in the river valleys, that made their ownership suddenly economically significant in ways that the original colonial cartographers could not have anticipated. The treaty negotiations that produced the modern border between Bolivia and Brazil resulted, in this particular stretch of territory, in a document that described a boundary line using geographical reference points that the surveying technology of the time could not locate with sufficient precision. The rivers and hills and other natural features used to define the border in this section of the boundary did not match reality in the way the treaty authors assumed they would. When surveyors actually went into the field and attempted to mark the boundary on the ground, they found discrepancies. The river they were supposed to follow did not flow where the treaty said it flowed, or it flowed differently at different seasons, or the features that were supposed to anchor the boundary measurement were ambiguous on the ground in ways they were not ambiguous on the map. The result of this surveying reality was a zone of territory, roughly 90 kilometers long, where neither country's border markers could be definitively established without essentially redrawing the treaty, and neither country had the political will or the diplomatic bandwidth to do that. So the zone was documented, noted, added to the category of things to be resolved later, and then life continued and later never quite arrived. This is how most administrative ambiguities survive. Not through any active decision to maintain them, but through the accumulated weight of other priorities. The zone between Bolivia and Brazil was never a flashpoint. It never produced a war or a serious diplomatic crisis. The people living in it were not wealthy enough, or numerous enough, or loud enough to force a resolution from either capital. And so the ambiguity persisted, decade after decade, treaty review after treaty review, generation after generation, until the zone became not just an administrative anomaly, but a lived reality, a place where people had built their lives inside a gap in the system. The technical name for the situation that exists in zones like this one is a terra nullius condition, but that phrase requires immediate and significant qualification, because terra nullius, in its strict legal sense, means land belonging to no one, unclaimed and uninhabited, and the zone we are discussing is neither unclaimed in a practical sense nor uninhabited. People live there, communities exist there, the land is used and occupied and has been for generations. What the zone lacks is not human presence but official governmental assignment. It exists in the space between two jurisdictions without being formally incorporated into either, which is a very different thing from belonging to no one in any meaningful sense. The distinction matters enormously for the people who live there, because if the land belonged to no one in fact as well as in law, then the situation would be simply remote emptiness, and the question of jurisdiction would be academic. But the zone has inhabitants, and the inhabitants are people with the same fundamental needs as people everywhere: access to legal identity, to health care, to education, to economic systems, to property rights, to the basic infrastructure of governance that most people in most countries take entirely for granted. And in a zone of ambiguous jurisdiction, all of those needs become complicated in ways that range from inconvenient to dangerous. Consider what it means to be born in a place that no government officially claims. In most countries, birth is accompanied by registration, the formal entry of a new person into the legal system of the state. The birth certificate is the foundational document of legal identity. It is what you need to get a passport, to enroll in school, to open a bank account, to access health services, to vote, to exist in the administrative world that modern states have constructed around every person within their territory. In a zone of ambiguous jurisdiction, the question of which country's birth registration system applies is genuinely unclear. A child born there is potentially registrable in either Bolivia or Brazil, or potentially in neither, depending on which local authority is willing to process the paperwork and which set of rules is applied. The practical consequences of this extend far beyond paperwork. A person without clear legal identity cannot cross borders legally, cannot travel on a passport, cannot access government services that require proof of citizenship or residency. In a region where access to hospitals and schools often requires travel to larger towns across borders, the administrative ambiguity of the zone creates real obstacles to basic welfare. People have found ways around these obstacles over the generations, as people always do, through informal arrangements, through the goodwill of local officials on both sides of the technical boundary, through the particular flexibility that tends to exist in remote border regions where the enforcement capacity of the central government is limited and local pragmatism fills the gap. But these are workarounds, not solutions, and they are contingent on the continued goodwill of individuals rather than the protection of law. The economic consequences are similarly complex. Property rights in the zone are based on arrangements that exist outside the formal legal systems of either country. Land is bought and sold, inherited, used as collateral for informal lending, managed through community agreements that have no formal legal status in either Bolivia or Brazil. This creates a situation of perpetual insecurity. A person who has farmed the same land for 30 years, whose parents farmed it before them, may have no legal title to that land that would stand up in any formal court. The absence of formal property rights does not mean the absence of community-recognized rights, and in practice, local communities have systems for managing land and resources that function reasonably well within the zone. But they function without the backing of state enforcement, which means they function on trust and on local power dynamics, and both of those can fail in ways that formal legal systems, however imperfect, are designed to prevent. Now, to understand why neither Bolivia nor Brazil has moved to formally resolve this situation, you need to understand something about the relationship that both countries have with their remote border regions more generally, and also something specific about the political economy of this particular zone. Bolivia is a landlocked country in the interior of South America, and one of the poorer nations in the hemisphere, with a long and complicated history of external pressure on its territory. It lost its coastal access in the War of the Pacific in the 19th century, a loss that shaped Bolivian national identity in ways that are still politically significant today. The loss of territory is a sensitive subject in Bolivia, and any formal relinquishment of claim to territory, even territory that Bolivia has never effectively administered, carries political costs that Bolivian governments have consistently been reluctant to bear. The zone on the Brazilian border is not territory that Bolivia actively uses or develops, but formally acknowledging that it does not belong to Bolivia is a different political act from simply not administering it, and the distinction matters to a country with a territorial history as painful as Bolivia's. Brazil, on the other side, is the largest country in South America and one of the largest in the world, with a land area of over 8.5 million square kilometers, and a border zone management challenge that is genuinely staggering in scale. The Brazilian border with its 10 neighboring countries runs for over 16,000 kilometers through every kind of terrain imaginable, from dense Amazonian forest to high mountain passes to river deltas to dry savanna. Managing all of that border effectively, even to the minimal standard of knowing what is happening along it, is an enormous administrative and logistical challenge. The specific 90-kilometer zone we are discussing is, from the perspective of the Brazilian federal government in Brasilia, a very small and very remote piece of a very large and very complex border management problem. The political incentive to invest the diplomatic and administrative capital needed to formally resolve the zone's ambiguous status has consistently been outweighed by other priorities. This is not a story of malice. It is a story of institutional inertia, operating in a context of genuine complexity, and it is a story that is replicated in various forms along border zones around the world. The gap between the tidy lines on maps and the messy reality of the Earth's surface is a permanent feature of human geography, and the zones where that gap is most visible are among the most revealing places in the world to study if you want to understand how governance actually works, as opposed to how it is supposed to work in theory. But there is more to this story than the legal and political mechanics, and I want to make sure we do not reduce the zone to an administrative problem, because that framing obscures the most important thing about it, which is that it is a place where people live. The communities that exist in and around the zone are not populations waiting for a government to arrive and organize them. They are communities with their own organization, their own social structures, their own histories and economies and cultural practices. The border zone in this part of South America is home to a mix of populations that reflects the complex demographic history of the region. There are indigenous communities whose presence in the landscape predates the existence of Bolivia and Brazil as nation-states by centuries or millennia. Communities whose traditional territories were divided by colonial and post-colonial border drawing without any consultation with the people whose lives the borders would affect. There are mestizo farming communities that settled the region in the 19th and 20th centuries, drawn by land availability and the particular opportunity that frontier zones offer to people who are looking for space to build something outside the formal systems that governed life in more established regions. There are communities of Brazilian and Bolivian migrants whose movement across the border has been so fluid and continuous over generations that their families contain members who identify as belonging to both countries, or to neither in the national sense, but primarily to the specific place where they have made their lives. The indigenous communities deserve particular attention because for them the question of the zone's ambiguous jurisdiction is not primarily a modern administrative inconvenience. It is the latest chapter in a much longer story about the relationship between their communities and the states that claim authority over the territories they inhabit. The indigenous peoples of this region belong to groups that have inhabited the transitional zone between the Bolivian highlands and the Brazilian lowlands for hundreds of generations. Their traditional territories span what is now the border between two countries, and the border, from the perspective of their community geography, makes no more inherent sense than if someone had drawn a line through the middle of a village and announced that one side of the line belonged to one country and the other side to another. The traditional movement patterns of these communities, the routes between seasonal resource areas, between communities linked by kinship and trade, between sacred sites and settlements, do not follow the border. They predate the border, and they have continued in modified form since the border was drawn, because communities adapt to the constraints placed on them and find ways to maintain the connections they need to maintain, even when those connections become technically complicated. The Bolivian state has, in recent decades, made significant commitments to indigenous rights, reflected in the 2009 Constitution, which is one of the most comprehensive recognitions of indigenous rights in the world, giving constitutional status to indigenous autonomy and collective land rights and cultural sovereignty in ways that have few parallels globally. But constitutional commitments and on-the-ground reality in remote border zones are separated by a very large distance, not just in space but in institutional capacity. And the indigenous communities in the zone have often found that the distance between what the Constitution promises and what they can actually access is substantial. Brazil has its own framework for indigenous rights and indigenous land demarcation, administered through the federal agency FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, and Brazil has demarcated indigenous territories across large portions of its Amazon and Cerrado regions. But the process of demarcation is slow and politically contested, particularly in border regions where the presence of indigenous territory can conflict with the interests of agricultural and ranching interests that are among the most politically powerful constituencies in the Brazilian Congress. The zone we are discussing sits in exactly this political fault line. One of the reasons neither country has moved aggressively to formally claim and administer the zone is precisely because the formal administration of the zone would require each country to make decisions about land rights and indigenous rights and agricultural rights that are politically complicated in ways that the current ambiguity avoids. The zone, in other words, is not just an accident of colonial cartography that no one has gotten around to fixing. It is also a space of managed ambiguity, where the absence of formal jurisdiction is, at some level, convenient for political systems that would find its formal incorporation difficult to navigate. This is not a cynical observation, it is a structural one. Governments everywhere make decisions about which problems to solve and in what order, and the calculation is almost always partly about political cost and political benefit. A formal resolution of the zone's status would require one or both countries to take on a set of politically sensitive commitments to indigenous communities, to existing landholders, to each other diplomatically, that neither has found the moment to take on. The zone persists in ambiguity, partly because ambiguity is, from the perspective of both governments, a less costly state than the alternatives. The people living in the zone have developed their own relationships with this ambiguity. In the border communities of this region, it is common for families to hold both Bolivian and Brazilian documents, obtained through the practical flexibility that local officials on both sides of the border have extended over the generations, because the alternative, rigidly denying services to people based on a jurisdictional ambiguity that neither government has resolved, is both impractical and plainly unjust. The dual document situation creates its own complications, of course. Different services accessed under different identities, different legal obligations potentially applying to the same person depending on which context they are operating in, the navigation of two bureaucratic systems simultaneously, each with its own requirements and its own inconsistencies. But it also creates a certain practical freedom. The border communities of this region, precisely because of the jurisdictional ambiguity that makes their administrative lives complicated, have developed a relationship with the border that is fundamentally different from the relationship that people in clearly demarcated, heavily enforced border zones have with it. The border here is a zone rather than a line, a gradient rather than a wall, a region of overlap rather than a region of exclusion. People move through it in both directions, in pursuit of work and family and services and goods, and the movement has created a kind of binational community culture, a hybrid that belongs to neither country fully, but draws on both. The languages of the zone reflect this hybridization. Spanish is the official language of Bolivia. Portuguese is the official language of Brazil. In the border communities, particularly among people who have grown up in or near the zone, a creolized mixture is common in informal speech, switching between Spanish and Portuguese depending on context and interlocutor, borrowing vocabulary from both, and developing grammatical shortcuts that allow communication across what is officially a language boundary. This is not linguistic confusion or deficiency. It is linguistic adaptation, the same process that produces all the world's creoles and pidgins and contact varieties, which are among the most linguistically creative and structurally sophisticated forms of language, precisely because they were built by people who needed to communicate across a gap and found a way to do it. The local economy of the zone reflects the same kind of adaptive pragmatism. The formal economic systems of Bolivia and Brazil, their currencies, their tax regimes, their trading regulations, their banking systems, apply differently in the zone, or apply with varying degrees of practical enforcement. What has developed in their place, or alongside them, is an informal cross-border economy that is both more resilient and more vulnerable than formal economic systems. More resilient because it is not dependent on the administrative functioning of either state, and the state's administrative functioning in remote border regions is often unreliable. More vulnerable because it lacks the legal protections and the access to formal financial systems that give formal economies their stability. The goods that move through the zone reflect the economic geography of the two countries. Bolivia produces certain agricultural goods in abundance, and certain manufactured goods come in more cheaply through Bolivia's import regime. Brazil has different abundances and different cost structures for different products. The border zone community is, informally and largely by necessity, a trading zone, where the price differentials between two national economies create opportunities that people are not going to leave unexploited simply because the legal framework for exploiting them is unclear. This informal cross-border trade is not smuggling in any meaningful moral sense, even if it sometimes operates outside formal customs systems. It is people living in the gap between two economic systems and making use of the gap to sustain themselves. But the zone also attracts uses that are less benign, and this is the dimension of the story that requires honest engagement, because to ignore it would be to sentimentalize a situation that is genuinely complicated. The same jurisdictional ambiguity that makes the zone difficult for legitimate residents to navigate also makes it attractive to activities that benefit from operating outside the reach of either state's enforcement mechanisms. Drug trafficking routes in South America have historically sought precisely the kind of ambiguous zones where neither country's law enforcement is clearly responsible for policing. The zone between Bolivia and Brazil, along with other ambiguous border areas in the region, has been identified by law enforcement agencies on both sides as an area of concern for narcotics trafficking, for the movement of contraband goods, and for other activities that exploit the gap in formal jurisdiction. This is not a reflection of the character of the zone's legitimate residents. It is a reflection of geography and institutional logic. When a zone lacks clear state authority, the activities that benefit from that absence will find their way to it. This has been true throughout human history, and the appropriate response to it is not to blame the people who live in the zone, but to understand that the jurisdictional ambiguity itself creates conditions that attract harmful activities alongside the legitimate adaptive responses of a community trying to survive. The presence of these activities makes the situation of the zone's legitimate residents more difficult. Law enforcement operations in the region, when they occur, are imprecise in their impacts, affecting the whole community of the zone rather than only the specific activities they are targeting. The zone's reputation as an area of lawlessness, however unfair to its majority of legitimate inhabitants, affects how it is perceived from both capitals and from international contexts, which in turn makes it harder for residents to advocate for their legitimate needs and rights. There have been periodic efforts by both the Bolivian and Brazilian governments to establish greater administrative presence in the zone, military outposts, health clinics, educational missions, infrastructure projects. These efforts have been inconsistent in their intensity and their duration, reflecting the rhythms of political priority and budget allocation rather than any sustained commitment to the zone's population. When an administration in Brasilia or La Paz has decided to focus attention on remote border zone administration, resources flow to the zone and visible changes occur. When the political priority shifts, as it inevitably does given the size and complexity of both countries, the resources thin and the zone returns to its characteristic state of minimal formal governance. The cycle is not unique to this zone. It characterizes the relationship between central governments and remote peripheral populations across the developing world, and in many parts of the developed world as well. The language of inclusion and development that governments use in relation to their peripheral populations is often sincere at the level of stated intention and inadequate at the level of sustained implementation, not because the people making the commitments are dishonest, but because the institutional systems of governance consistently prioritize the populations that are most politically visible and most economically central, and remote border communities are by definition neither. What makes the zone on the Bolivia-Brazil border particularly interesting as an object of study is not that it is unusual in all its features. Many of its features, the jurisdictional ambiguity, the informal cross-border economy, the indigenous communities navigating between state systems that did not consult them in their design, the cycle of governmental attention and neglect, are replicated in border zones around the world. What makes it interesting is the combination of features, and particularly the fact that the ambiguity is so formally documented. Both governments know the zone exists. Both governments have been presented with the question of what to do about it at various points. And both have consistently chosen, through a combination of genuine complexity and political calculation, not to resolve it. The zone is therefore not a forgotten corner of the map, a place that slipped through the administrative net by accident without anyone noticing. It is a known gap, a documented ambiguity, a place that appears in the files of foreign ministries and border agencies and international legal discussions about territorial jurisdiction. Its existence is not the product of ignorance. It is the product of decision-making, even if the decision has been consistently to defer rather than to choose. And that deferral, sustained over decades and across multiple governments on both sides, has had the effect of converting a temporary administrative problem into a permanent social reality. The people who live in the zone today were born into its ambiguity. Their parents, and in many cases their grandparents, were born into it. The zone has not been waiting, emptily, for a government to arrive and fill it. It has been filling itself, with community and culture and economy and social organization, in the way that human beings always fill the spaces they inhabit, regardless of whether the administrative framework around those spaces is clear or confused. The villages in the zone have their own leaders, informal authorities recognized by the community rather than appointed by either state. They have their own dispute resolution mechanisms, built from mixtures of indigenous customary law, Brazilian and Bolivian legal concepts absorbed through contact with both systems, and pragmatic local innovation developed to address situations that no formal legal code quite covers. They have their own festivals and their own commemorations, marking events in the specific history of this specific place, rather than the national holidays of either Bolivia or Brazil, though both of those are also celebrated, in the way that border communities often celebrate multiple national days because it is both practically convenient and culturally genuine. The schools in the zone, where they exist, face a curriculum question that is existential rather than pedagogical. Which country's curriculum do you teach in a place that belongs to neither? The practical answer that has emerged in most of the zone's communities is some version of both, or more precisely, a locally adapted curriculum that draws on both Bolivian and Brazilian educational frameworks, while also incorporating the specific local knowledge that neither national curriculum covers. Children in the zone learn Spanish and Portuguese, which is a genuine advantage in a continent where the two dominant languages run alongside each other for thousands of kilometers of border. They learn the history of both Bolivia and Brazil, which gives them a perspective on the national narratives of their neighboring states that people inside those states rarely achieve. They learn the geography of the region from the ground, not from a map, which is a different and in many ways deeper form of geographic knowledge. The health situation in the zone is more straightforwardly difficult than the educational one. Medical emergencies do not wait for jurisdictional clarification. When someone in the zone needs emergency medical care, they need it in the way that everyone needs emergency medical care, immediately and without administrative preconditions. The nearest hospitals are in towns on one side or the other of the zone, which means emergency medical transport involves crossing a border and engaging with health systems that may not have clear obligations to patients from the zone. The practical solution that has evolved is the same informal flexibility that characterizes everything about the zone's relationship with its neighboring states: local health workers, community knowledge of traditional medicine, and an informal understanding among health facilities in the border towns that they will treat patients from the zone as a matter of humanitarian practice, regardless of the formal questions of coverage and payment and jurisdiction. This informal humanitarianism is real, and it matters, and it would be wrong to describe the zone as abandoned by all human concern. The local officials on both sides of the formal border, the mayors of border towns, the health workers, the teachers, the military personnel stationed in the region, have generally extended practical decency to the zone's population in ways that formal policy has not required of them. This is worth acknowledging, because the story of the zone is not simply a story of governmental neglect. It is also a story of the gap between formal governmental systems and the human relationships that exist within and around those systems, and those human relationships have sometimes been more responsive to the zone's residents than the formal systems have been. But informal humanitarianism is not a substitute for formal rights, and this is the tension at the core of the zone's situation. The people who live there deserve the security of formal legal recognition, not because the informal arrangements are always bad, but because informal arrangements are contingent on the continued goodwill of individuals and institutions that could change without notice, and because the absence of formal rights means the absence of the specific protections that formal rights are designed to provide: protections against arbitrary treatment, protections for property and livelihood, protections for the most vulnerable members of the community. The zone's children deserve more than informal access to education. They deserve formal enrollment in a system that will give them credentials recognized by either country, credentials they can carry with them if they choose to leave the zone and build their lives in the broader economy of Bolivia or Brazil. The zone's elderly deserve more than informal goodwill from border town hospitals. They deserve formal coverage in a health system that will treat them as a matter of right rather than charity. The zone's farmers deserve more than informal community recognition of their land rights. They deserve formal title that would stand up in court if someone attempted to take their land. None of these things require the resolution of the jurisdictional question to be entirely settled. Both countries could, if they chose, extend formal rights to the zone's population without first resolving which country the zone formally belongs to. There are legal frameworks for this in international law, mechanisms for extending rights to stateless or jurisdictionally ambiguous populations that do not require first establishing full territorial sovereignty. The Bolivian constitution's strong protections for indigenous rights could be extended more effectively to indigenous communities in the zone. Brazil's indigenous land demarcation system could be applied to Brazilian-descended communities in the zone. Both countries' social service systems could be extended to the zone on an overlapping or cooperative basis. The fact that these mechanisms exist and have not been widely deployed in the zone is another illustration of the gap between formal institutional capacity and political will. The tools are available. The decision to use them has not been made, because making it would require elevating the zone on the political priority list of both countries to a position it has not historically occupied. What would it take to change this? The history of similar zones around the world suggests a few different pathways. One is economic, when the discovery or development of significant economic resources in an ambiguous zone makes the question of which country benefits from those resources financially consequential. Governments have historically found the motivation to resolve ambiguities they had previously found it convenient to defer. If mineral deposits or agricultural potential, or some other resource of significant economic value were discovered or developed in the zone, the calculus of deferral would change rapidly for both governments. Another pathway is crisis. When an ambiguous zone becomes the site of a humanitarian crisis large enough to attract international attention, the political cost of continued ambiguity rises, and governments are motivated to act. The zone has experienced the kinds of chronic, low-level hardship that are devastatingly real for the people experiencing them, but do not produce the dramatic imagery that drives international attention. A sustained drought, a disease outbreak, a major incident of violence, any of these could theoretically elevate the zone's situation to visibility, though the hope that a population's access to rights should not depend on the occurrence of dramatic suffering is not just humanitarian sentiment, but a reasonable expectation of states that have formal obligations to populations within their claimed territory. A third pathway is advocacy. The communities of the zone, and the organizations and institutions that support them, have at various points engaged in formal advocacy with both governments for recognition of their situation and improvement of their circumstances. Indigenous rights organizations, human rights bodies, academic researchers, and journalists have documented the zone's conditions and presented them to relevant authorities. This advocacy has produced incremental improvements, greater attention from both governments during periods of political receptiveness, some extension of services, and administrative accessibility. The cumulative effect of this advocacy over decades has been real, even if it has not produced the fundamental resolution that would address the underlying problem. The international legal framework that governs territorial disputes and jurisdictional ambiguities, it should be acknowledged, not particularly well designed to address situations like the zone. International law has strong mechanisms for resolving disputes between states that both claim the same territory, but much weaker mechanisms for addressing situations where neither state is aggressively claiming territory and the ambiguity is a product of mutual deferral rather than active contest. The International Court of Justice and other arbitration mechanisms are available to states that want to submit border disputes for resolution, but neither Bolivia nor Brazil has had sufficient incentive to take this step specifically in relation to this zone. There is also a dimension of this story that connects to the broader history of indigenous sovereignty in South America that we touched on earlier but that deserves more sustained attention, because it reframes the question of jurisdiction in a way that neither Bolivia's nor Brazil's claim fully acknowledges. The indigenous communities, whose traditional territories include parts of the zone, have their own answer to the question of who has sovereignty over the land. The answer is not Bolivia. The answer is not Brazil. The answer is the community itself, which occupied and managed and understood this territory long before either state existed, and has continued to do so throughout the period of state claiming and state ambiguity. From the perspective of indigenous sovereignty, the question of which nation-state can claim the 90-kilometer zone is the wrong question. It is the question that colonial and post-colonial frameworks have imposed on a situation that those frameworks did not create and that they have not resolved well. This is not just a philosophical point, it has practical implications. The strongest legal and moral claims to determine the status of the zone may belong not to either national government but to the indigenous communities whose territory it is, under the framework of indigenous rights that both Bolivia and Brazil have formally endorsed in their domestic law and in international agreements including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. If the zone were formally recognized as indigenous territory under either country's law, or under a bilateral agreement between the two countries, it would still belong to one or the other for the purposes of international borders, but the question of who controls what happens inside it would be answered differently. The ambiguity would not be resolved by assignment to a national government, but by recognition of the indigenous community's prior and ongoing authority. This pathway exists in the legal framework. Both countries have demonstrated the capacity to demarcate indigenous territory and recognize indigenous governance within it. The barriers are political rather than legal. The agricultural and ranching interests that have expanded into the transitional zone between the Bolivian highlands and the Brazilian lowlands over the past century are not interests that would welcome an expansion of indigenous land recognition in the area. These interests are politically powerful in both countries, and their resistance to indigenous land rights has historically been one of the primary obstacles to effective implementation of those rights in remote frontier zones. The zone, viewed through this lens, is not primarily a story about border making or colonial cartography or international law, though it is all of those things. It is primarily a story about land and power and who gets to decide what happens to the territory that exists at the margins of state authority. That story is not unique to this zone. It is playing out across the interior of South America and across frontier zones on every continent, wherever the expansion of modern economic systems into areas of traditional indigenous occupancy has created conflicts between formal state authority and the prior claims of the people who were there first. The reason this zone is particularly revealing, the reason it is worth the depth of attention we have given it, is precisely because the jurisdictional ambiguity makes visible what is usually hidden. In regions where the state's claim is clear and its enforcement capacity sufficient, the conflicts between state authority and indigenous or community rights play out inside a framework that naturalizes the state's primacy and makes the other claims appear as departures from the norm. In the zone, where neither state's claim is clearly established, the underlying question of prior rights and community authority is not hidden beneath the state's apparent omnipotence. It is right on the surface, visible and undeniable. The people of the zone have built something real inside the gap. They have built communities with social structures and economies, and cultural practices, and knowledge systems that are specific to this place and its particular conditions. The rock of this place, metaphorically speaking, has been carved by its inhabitants into something habitable and meaningful, in the way that people every way carve meaning and community out of whatever material their particular geography provides them. That is what most of the discussions of the zone miss. The legal analyses and the political science and the border studies frameworks are all useful, but they frame the zone as a problem, a gap in the map that needs to be filled, an ambiguity that needs to be resolved. The people living there did not wait for the ambiguity to be resolved before building their lives. They built their lives inside the ambiguity, and they built them with the particular ingenuity and resilience that human beings develop when the formal systems of support are not available and they have to make do with what they have. This is not a romantic argument for leaving the zone as it is. The residents of the zone deserve formal rights and formal protections, and their absence is a genuine injustice that both governments bear some responsibility for, but it is an argument for not reducing the zone's residents to victims of an administrative failure. They are first and foremost the people who live there, who have always lived there, who have made this particular stretch of South American landscape their home, and who know it with the depth of knowledge that comes from inhabiting a place across generations. The 90 kilometers of ambiguous territory on the Bolivia-Brazil border is, in the end, not primarily a problem of international law or colonial cartography, though it is a product of both. It is primarily a landscape with rivers and vegetation and seasonal patterns of rain and heat, with soil that has particular qualities and challenges, with wildlife that moves through it according to its own patterns, with the accumulated knowledge of the people who have lived in it for generations, knowledge of how to farm this particular land and find water in it, and read its weather, and maintain relationships with the neighbors that the particular conditions of this place have made necessary. The border between Bolivia and Brazil runs through that landscape, or fails to run through it clearly, and the gap in the border's clarity has produced a community that belongs to both countries and to neither, that speaks both languages and neither perfectly, that holds both countries' documents and neither country